You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. I've got a really great guest today, Scerri. Some of his background, he's written several books on chemistry and the periodic table, including the periodic table, its story and significance, a very short introduction to the periodic table, a tale of seven elements, a tale of seven scientists, and a new philosophy of science. And he's one of the world's experts on the historical and philosophical aspects of the periodic table and the elements, which I think will be a really fascinating thing to talk about. So, Eric, thanks for coming.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. So what got you interested in something as unusual as the periodic table?
Well, it's not that unusual, actually. A lot of children seem to love it. I got to like it as a kid. It's got a certain appeal. Well, there are many things that are appealing about it. It seems to embody order. It embodies all the elements. So it embodies the stuff out of which everything is made, barring weird things like dark matter and dark energy, which are relative newcomers onto the scene. But everything, apart from those exceptions that we can see, is made up of the elements, and all the elements appear to be connected into this one chart. No other science has anything like it.
What's I've always wondered this. I'd asked, in the movies they'll say there's these different elements that appear on different planets and things like that. But to the knowledge of science, all the elements in the periodic table, there are no others that are out there in the universe, seemingly, and everything we see in the universe is composed of some or more of the elements in the periodic table.
Right, although it is conceivable that in some galaxies or under some very extreme conditions, there may just be some of these super heavy elements that we've been forming on Earth for the past 60 or 70 years. And actually, there are a couple of elements which are only observed in outer space. The element promethium is a synthetic element on Earth. It had to be created artificially, but it does seem to exist in the stars.
And I've heard that, I guess the heaviest natural elements is uranium, right? With 92 atomic number.
That's correct. Yeah.
So beyond that, from what I know, most of the elements are unstable, and some of them extremely short-lived. But are there some that are very long-lived that last for a while? I guess maybe plutonium.
Plutonium does, and some of the ones slightly above 92, which is uranium, can be long-lived. There are some surprising ones. The other day I came across an element which, if I remember correctly, had an atomic number of about 104, 105, and it had a half-life of 29 hours, which for an element as heavy as that is something surprising. Among the most recently discovered was element 118, and that has a half-life of less than a microsecond, which seems almost absurd to the layperson because, it's so short-lived that it seems almost ridiculous to spend vast amounts of energy and funding in order to create these elements that are going to last for less than a second or less than a microsecond in this case. But of course, it's a scientific challenge of being able to produce them. And even though they last for such a short period of time, it is possible with modern technology to be able to characterize them and to be sure that one has the particular element one is claiming that one has.
Well, what's the speed at which chemical reactions customarily occur?
Oh, all kinds of speeds. I mean, there's the whole gamut of reaction times.
I mean, do some occur far faster than a microsecond?
Yes.
Okay, because
definitely.
that tells me that it would be useful to find elements that, even if they're so short-lived, perhaps we can involve them in chemical reactions and create a stable version of that element, bonded to something else in a chemical reaction that is stable.
I suppose that's one way of looking at it. Yeah.
Is it a lame way of looking at it?
I don't want to say lame, but for example, given that these elements are so short-lived, we know almost next to nothing about their chemistry. So when you say forming compounds, we have no idea if they're going to form compounds. Some of the slightly earlier ones have been shown to form compounds for a very short space of time. So yeah. I mean, this is almost in the realm of science fiction, so anything is possible. But I say that because what the common reaction is, well, if they're that short-lived, why bother? And most chemists, in fact, would say that. These are nuclear physicists who are mostly interested in forming these very super heavy elements. They have no tangible applications. However, as I said earlier, it's a scientific challenge to be able to produce them. The technology that's required in order to produce them is worth pursuing just for itself. So there are spin-offs to the technology.
Well, the reason I ask you is, this is probably a pretty difficult question, but when you look at hydrogen versus helium versus lithium, et cetera, the only difference that I know as the layperson is the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons. But
That's
yet,
right.
There's all these emergent properties. How can that be just because the number of those three things differ? How could atoms have all these properties? It seems like an emergent phenomena from that, and I don't know how that could be.
I agree with you, and the study of emergence is more and more up and coming these days. But yeah, I mean, just to state what you're alluding to, if I understand you correctly, you're getting at the idea that the mere fact of adding a proton and an electron on going from hydrogen to helium gives you something that's very, very different. Hydrogen is reactive, helium is almost completely unreactive. Why should that be? Why should just that? That's what you're getting at. I agree with you. This is a deep, deep problem that science has only begun to consider, and if that, I mean, it's tended to be philosophers of science who are interested in the question of emergence. Scientists shy away from it because it's a deep, deep, difficult problem.
It's so fascinating. I mean, in a way, electrons are the currency of all chemistry. I mean, if you look at molecules, and I ask you the same question. So what's the difference between molecule A and B? It's the atoms that make it up. It's the bonding between them, I guess, and the orientation of the bonds, and then the ends or parts of the molecule that have unfilled valence shells.
Right.
But really, that's, I guess, in layman's terms, that's the only difference. But look at how many properties different molecules have. It's like unbelievable.
Yeah.
So how can all that come from just unfilled electron shells or bonds, or again, there's nothing new in that milieu of the molecule. It's so weird that it can be the basis of all life and all things. It's weird.
You're absolutely right. Incidentally, you seem to know a lot of chemistry. Did you have an education in chemistry yourself?
Yeah, I went to I did chemical engineering. I mean, a lot of it's been forgotten, but I know like the basics, I guess. So
yeah. Interesting. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
I mean, you've hit on a problem that, as much as we like to think we understand nature and we've made tremendous progress, but in some of these questions, I just gave a lecture and a student came up to me afterwards and said, why is there quantization of energy? And I said to him, I don't think anybody knows. We know that there is quantization, but if you ask the question, why is there quantization? In other words, why does nature choose to be quantized in the realm of the microscopic? We don't know. So science almost deludes itself in thinking that we're giving answers to why questions. We're really just describing, we're saying if you assume there's quantization, we can explain X, Y, and Z. And we push the question further and further. In a sense, we're getting at the why, but we're never really getting at the why. That's too big a question.
Do you feel that urge, though, to ask the why? Of course.
Of course.
Are you satisfied with the descriptive part of it?
No, I'm all for pushing the why question further and further, but also recognizing that we're not really giving an answer to the why question. We're not really giving causes in science. We're always pretty much giving correlations and descriptions and so on.
Yeah, that's too bad.
Well, yeah.
So what you must have studied the periodic table tremendously and in a multifaceted way. So what are some of the most exciting or interesting insights that you've gotten that people don't normally talk about because they haven't gone deep on it like you have?
Well, one of them, and it kind of connects with what you've just asked here. The periodic table is extremely simple. I mean, it's basically saying that as you progress through the elements, as we walk through the elements one by one, every now and then we get an approximate repetition in the properties of an element. So to give an example, lithium, sodium, and potassium are three elements that are separated in atomic number and atomic weight, and yet they have these remarkable similarities. In a sense, that's deeply, deeply mysterious. We think we understand it better because we can now say it's because they have similar electron configurations. They all have one outer electron. But then that just pushes the question further, or one can push the question further and say, why does the possession of one electron in each of these cases cause it to have such behavior? So this is an example of what you were getting at.
But in biological processes too, again, electrons seem to be the currency or the coin of the realm that everything operates on. The exchange of them, the interaction of them. It's very strange.
Yeah.
So, can you look at the repetition of properties in the periodic table as also a quantization? Just as the energies are quantized, so are the properties, and that's why they repeat, and that's why they.
Quite definitely. In fact, the existence of the periodic table seems to anticipate quantization because on many levels, it's saying that you have hydrogen, and then you have helium, and then you have lithium, and then you have nothing in between. That is in its, at the heart of it is a form of quantization. And it is a not all that well-known fact that quantum mechanics emerged partly as an attempt to explain the periodic table. And broadly speaking, it has explained the periodic table, going back to what I was just saying in terms of electron configuration. So initially, back in 1869, incidentally, the interest in the periodic table this year has reached almost fever pitch because it's the 150th anniversary of the discovery of the periodic system by the Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev. There were other people who discovered systems before him. His was by far the most successful. So when it was first discovered, it was completely mysterious as to why this repetition should occur. And then physics came along, and there were the discovery of the structure of the atom, the very existence of protons and electrons, then the idea that electrons occur in shells, and then depending on the details of those shells, one could begin to explain, I'm going to use the word why loosely, why lithium, sodium, and potassium, for example, are all similar. It's because they all have one outer shell electron.
So how has quantum mechanics been informed by the periodic table?
Okay. The early attempts to explain the periodic table led, for example, to the Bohr model of the atom, which is the earliest model that involved electron shells. And then that went a certain way, but the explanations were still sort of semi-empirical or somewhat ad hoc, somewhat circular. Then came the Schrodinger equation, when it was realized that the electron was as much a wave as it was a particle. And at this point, it was possible to explain in a way why there was quantization. I mean, there is, in a sense, an explanation which I should have given to my student, and which I will the next time I meet him. It's not really true to say we don't know why, but the explanation is sort of rather technical and mathematical. It goes in this way. It says in the Bohr model of the atom, the electrons were made to be in quantum shells by fiat. Bohr just assumed they were in particular energy levels, but wasn't able to say why they were behaving in that way. In the Schrodinger model, one has a differential equation which is solved by applying boundary conditions. Once you apply those boundary conditions, the quantization emerges naturally. It doesn't have to be put in by hand. And one of the boundary conditions is quite simply the fact that the electron is bound by the nucleus in the hydrogen atom. So by putting that in and cranking out the solutions to the Schrodinger equation, the quantization emerges. But people like Schrodinger and Pauli and Heisenberg and so on, the pioneers of quantum mechanics, actually set out to explain the periodic table. The Pauli exclusion principle was an attempt to explain the details of the periodic table. And then it became realized that the exclusion principle applied completely generally and is one of the fundamental theorems in modern physics, which, by the way, according to many people, has itself not yet been explained in a more fundamental way.
Yeah. I guess I think of the wave nature of electrons, and I imagine a sound wave, fitting in a box. And, if the box is of a certain dimension, certain waves can form standing waves. And if it's not, they can't. And you can't have half or a quarter of a wave, and that kind of thing.
Precisely.
Maybe that
precisely
links to it.
Or if
I don't know.
Or if you have a guitar string or a violin string that's bound at both ends, it can only vibrate as a whole number of half wavelengths or an integral number of wavelengths, but nothing in between. And so the quantization there, the ways in which the string can vibrate, are determined by the fact that the string is bound at both ends, at the nut and at the bridge in the case of a guitar. If the string was released from one end, then it could vibrate in any old fashion. By the way, there's a nice analogy with the electron there. Once the electron is lost from the atom, once it's ionized, it's no longer subject to the quantum conditions, and it can, in principle, have any energy.
That's right, yeah. Huh. Interesting.
So, although in the modern understanding, physics explains chemistry, it tends to be forgotten that, historically speaking, chemistry, in the form of the periodic table, gave birth to much of quantum physics. A lot of my work has been on the philosophy of chemistry and trying to understand whether chemistry is indeed reduced to physics, more specifically, whether quantum mechanics explains all of chemistry. And so this is my answer to the question is kind of yes and no. In many respects, I wouldn't want to deny that physics has been extremely influential, and through such things as quantum mechanics and the existence of the electron has been tremendously helpful in chemistry. But for reasons which go back to your point earlier about emergence, the reduction is not complete. If it was, it would have put all chemists out of business in the same way that biology would be out of business, because it could all be predicted from theoretical physics.
Right, yeah, that's true. The elements in the periodic table, if we look at the history of the universe, was there an evolution of them? Were certain elements present first, and then later on other elements present, and what does that look like if that's what happened?
According to astrophysics and cosmology, the very lightest elements, hydrogen, helium, lithium, and maybe a little beryllium, were formed in the Big Bang, and then the elements that come beyond that tend to be formed in the interior of stars, where the gravitational pressure is such that it allows nuclei to fuse together. And then in even more extreme conditions, like supernovae, then you can get the formation of heavier and heavier elements. This is where the expression "we are stardust" comes from. Joni Mitchell, or whoever it was who sang the song. Was it Joni Mitchell? Are you too young to know?
Sure. I've heard that before. Over what time period? For what time period do you think that the lightest elements existed? How long was it until heavier elements came about? And then at what point do we think that the entire periodic table of natural elements was out there existing?
I don't know the answer to that question. one hears about the first 3 seconds allowed the formation of protons, neutrons, and electrons, I believe, something like that. You need a good physicist for that one. I'm just a humble chemist and a philosopher of science. I'm afraid I don't know.
Yeah, no worries. What about the prevalence of the different elements, in the universe and on our planet, and then living versus non-living matter? Is there any
rhyme or reason?
Us anything? Yeah, does that tell us anything?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, for instance, living organisms. Obviously, they have elements like carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, the so-called SNOPs elements, C, H, N, O, P, and sulfur. And they're very abundant. Then you have elements that are of intermediate abundance, things like sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, calcium in bones, of course. Potassium occurs in the brain and so on. And then you have elements that occur in trace amounts, but are still extremely important, such as zinc in enzymes, such as iron in the blood, such as cobalt in vitamin B12, and so on. So if one looks at the periodic table, there's absolutely no indication of that. So I suppose biology cannot be read off the periodic table, certainly not in terms of abundance of elements. That story is, the origin of life. While I'm talking about the origin of life, there's something rather remarkable that I came across the other day while teaching general chemistry, actually, which was that the hemoglobin molecule, which is so important in biology, contains a very complicated molecule, a heme molecule, which is able to form up to 4 bonds with an atom of iron, Fe. The chlorophyll molecule contains exactly the same sort of heme molecule, and it forms bonds with a magnesium atom, and that's the basis of plant life. So if ever there was a graphic demonstration of how all of life is unified, there it is. And it's as if animals chose to go with iron and plants chose to go with magnesium, or better said, one day an iron atom was captured by a heme molecule and it led to animals, and on a different day the heme molecule captured a magnesium atom and that led to plant life. And it's rather nice to juxtapose the two structures and say, look, if you doubt that everything has a common origin, every living organism has a common origin, there it is. It's jumping out at us in those molecules.
That's amazing. Are there other candidate molecules that a heme molecule could bond to in a similar way? Suggesting other paths of life that we don't see.
In principle, yes. Yes, one could vary the heme molecule. Yeah, synthetic biology. Here we come. Yeah.
I'm sure some people out there are doing exactly that and experimenting. Maybe using sulfur or other things.
Indeed. The front page of this week's Economist features synthetic biology. I haven't got round to reading the article yet, but it's one that I've put to one side to have a good look at.
Okay. An idea occurred to me. What can we learn anything from the chemistry of radioactive isotopes of elements? If an element is radioactive, let's say like iodine, one of the isotopes. Is the chemistry of it different because it's an isotope, or is it the same? And what does it tell you either way?
Okay. There are tremendous applications of radioisotopes, as they're called, and it's precisely because their chemistry is identical, so the biological system will take up the isotope, but its physics is different. And in other words, you can see it, you can detect it in a way that you couldn't detect a non-radioactive atom. So one good example is technetium, which is one of these artificial elements, which is used in scanning in medicine. And it's because certain technetium isotopes, in fact all of them, are radioactive, and therefore they will literally light up under certain scanning conditions. So the answer to your question is this is a huge, huge area of science. And when it was discovered that isotopes could do this, it opened up completely new vistas. Much of medicine has been revolutionized by the use of radioisotopes, and there are many different ones.
But what does it tell you that the chemistry is the same, but the physics are different. Does that elucidate anything about, the questions I've been asking and the questions you have about emergent properties, again, of atoms or molecules, about just chemistry in general?
I'm not sure, although, I'm open to persuasion, but I'm not sure that this would be a case of emergence. This is a case of, because they have different masses, different isotopes have the same number of protons and electrons, and going back to what we were saying earlier, because they have the same number of electrons, they're going to behave in the same way. But because the nuclei have different masses, then they're going to have other properties that are not the same. And those tend to be the physical properties, like melting point, boiling point, and so on. Density is going to be different. So I wouldn't think, although I may be wrong, that this is a case of emergence. In other words, we understand exactly why isotopes have same chemical properties, but different physical properties.
Oh, okay. I guess there's a chemistry cookbook. You vary the number of protons, you get certain behaviors. You vary the electrons and where they are, and you get other behaviors. And same thing with neutrons. So
yeah.
They all have
but isotopes
is
a slightly different situation. You're as I was saying, you're not varying the number of, let's say, isotopes of hydrogen. You're not varying the protons. It's one in every case. You're not varying the electrons, but you're just doubling the mass in the case of hydrogen, or tripling the mass in the case of the isotope tritium. And then if you try and form water from those three isotopes, H2O is different from D2O, deuterium oxide, which is also different from tritium oxide, or T2O. T2O happens to be radioactive. But even D2O, apparently when fish are exposed to D2O, they die in a matter of hours. They can't live in heavy water. We can drink it, but it doesn't do us much good, but it doesn't kill us either.
Yeah, I can see why it's such a fascinating area. It's amazing, all the implications of it. So what other insights do you have, again, into the periodic table and into chemistry, again, from your long study of it? What are you working on in your head right now?
Sure. One of the interesting things about the periodic table is that although there's presumably one periodic system, meaning one relationship between the elements, it has been represented in quite literally more than 1,000 forms, both in print and these days on the internet, which allows greater powers of representation. So the natural question has been, especially among philosophers of chemistry, is there one optimal periodic table? And there people seem to differ. Many chemists will say, well, it's a human construction, and therefore it doesn't really matter how you represent the elements. Others want to answer that question, and they believe that it is a legitimate question to be seeking for the one optimal periodic table, even if we can never quite arrive at that. One rather interesting candidate for the optimal periodic table, which has attracted quite a lot of attention, is something called the left step periodic table. It's called that because it consists of a series of steps going up, starting low on the left and then moving up like a staircase.
Yeah.
What is involved here is two moves. I was going to say two steps, but let's say two moves. First of all, you take helium, which is traditionally placed at the top of the noble gases, and you move helium to the top of group 2. So it's in the same group now as beryllium, magnesium, calcium, and strontium. The justification for doing that is that it's got helium has two electrons. Beryllium, magnesium, calcium, and so on also have two outer electrons. So from a physics point of view, from the point of view of the atomic structure, that is a perfectly legitimate move to make. What you then do is you cut off the first two columns of the periodic table, known as the S block, and you paste that S block on the right-hand edge of the periodic table. Right? So there have been these two changes, the repositioning of helium and the repositioning of the now modified S block. This has some rather remarkable properties. Compared to the normal periodic table that we often see, sometimes called the twin tower periodic table, where hydrogen and helium are separated as much as possible, they now occur next to each other But in addition, we have the fact that every single period length repeats. In other words, whereas in the traditional table, the first period is very anomalous. It consists of two elements, and then you immediately go into two periods of 8, then two periods of 18, then two periods of 32. The first period is the only one that is not repeated or doubled. In this new left step periodic table, every period is doubled, which gives the impression, to some people at least, of greater depth. That this removal of the anomaly, that the first period does not repeat, is regarded by some, I include myself, as being significant. I think this is a hint that this left step periodic table is perhaps an improvement on the traditional one. Now, when I say new, it was actually devised back in the 1930s. It's been rediscovered several times. It's not really new. Chemists, of course, have a difficulty with such a table because to a chemist, helium is the ultimate noble gas. It's the most noble of the noble gases because it's the least reactive. So the act of separating it from its traditional home in the noble gases and moving it to be among a bunch of metals seems to be rather outrageous. It's also interesting because this presents the tension between chemistry and physics when it comes to discussing the periodic table. Should the chemist have the last word? Traditionally, they think that they should because it was discovered by chemists. Or should physics have the last word? Because, of course, physics explains everything.
Well, this tells me a couple of things. One is that, people crave symmetry. They like it. That's what beauty is considered to be.
Yep.
So maybe that's one reason that people like it. But I would think it would be a great exercise to display the periodic table in as many different ways as you could think of. One way is like the traditional way, like you said, the Twin Tower way. Another way maybe is by some other property of it. Maybe another way is maybe some of the elements should have two places or three places in the table because they seem to live in two worlds or three worlds or four worlds.
Right.
So I would think if you went ahead and again, displayed the periodic table in a whole bunch of ways and sorted it differently depending on what you were looking at, you would see things. You would get unique insights.
Correct. However, you would still want to know what is the most fundamental table. And if you were to only restrict yourselves to individual properties, let's say boiling points or melting points or bonding behavior, you would always perhaps remain on the surface. It would be a bit like when biologists were trying to classify flowers, shall we say, by counting the number of petals. Whereas now we know that to really classify plants, we have to go down to the level of DNA. So in other words, superficial or specific behavior can be misleading. You need as fundamental a description as possible in order to get your ultimate classification. But I agree with you. It's very interesting to look at the variety of periodic tables. I'm not trying to do away with the variety, but I'm just saying it's one of the interesting questions as to whether one should even be looking for one best possible periodic table.
That's what I was going to say, is maybe that's a mistake, is to want one. Because, look at other things in nature. Again, the wave-particle duality of light. There's not one, there's two. Maybe the fundament for certain things is 2 or more than 2 or 10, I don't know. So
Yeah. Okay, my response to that, it's interesting you take that position. My response to that is usually to say this, that in science, we progress through more and more accurate theories, shall we say. So, for instance, we went from classical mechanics of Newton to quantum mechanics for the microscopic world. And in that respect, we're not saying let Newton's theory coexist with quantum mechanics. We're saying quantum mechanics is the better theory. It gives the better insight into nature. So there's a lot of talk.
Or is it at larger scales that it doesn't? That effect falls away, and then Newtonian mechanics is better at that point.
I don't
there
think,
again,
Yeah. No, let me take up that point. I don't think Newtonian mechanics is ever better. It's just the fact that for large objects, it's not worth working out the quantum mechanics of it because it's more cumbersome. But fundamentally, every object is quantum mechanical. So I'm not sure I would agree to say that there are certain conditions. practically speaking, yes, it's easier to solve the Newtonian mechanical equations. But if you ask for what is giving the fundamental description, even of the large objects, I think physicists would argue that even there, quantum mechanics is simply the more fundamental theory. It's, if you like, Newton is a subset of quantum mechanics. It's been eaten up by quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics can explain everything Newton can explain and more.
I got you. I see what you mean. I guess the more useful way, without unnecessary complication. You want to understand the fundamental form is what you're saying. But
yes,
in practical, everyday use,
exactly,
applied science, it is easier to have these different models.
Of course. An engineer would never reach for quantum mechanics when wanting to solve a problem about bridge building or something of that kind, because for those sized objects, it would be a nuisance to try and quantize things. The quantization is.
But if we weren't aware of quantum mechanics, then GPS systems would have a problem, and so yeah.
Right.
It's interesting, the distinction there. Maybe that's why we have such trouble. I'm also fascinated by interfaces. What happens? At what size of scale are you truly at the interface between, the quantum realm and not? At what temperature are you, an intermediate phase of matter? At what pressure? At what? I always wonder what happens at these interfaces.
Yeah, and I understand that that's an area of active research. Precisely that, the junction of, or at what point does quantum merge into Newtonian and vice versa?
Yeah. Well, sorry, I'm asking you all the tough questions. But...
No, I prefer the tough questions.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's another question itself. Is there anything you seem to get asked about all the time when you talk about your areas of focus? And do you think that those are informative, or would you rather talk about other areas? Like, what you've been interviewed many times. Where does the focus tend to go, and why do you think that is?
People often ask about the super heavy elements and ask about, is it worth it? And again, I would give the more scientific answer that I gave earlier, that however exotic it seems, given that these things don't have applications and will not have applications in the foreseeable future because they're so short-lived, it's still worth pursuing because we're pushing the boundaries of the periodic table. And in fact, this raises an interesting question, that these super heavy elements are behaving in a fashion whereby it looks like the periodic table has, in a sense, met its match or has run out of steam, because there are many elements, many very heavy elements, that don't behave in the predicted fashion. So they fall in a particular group, you make predictions about what they should be like, and their behavior defies those predictions. But even this is fairly well understood now by a relatively new branch called relativistic quantum mechanics, where one applies relativity theory to the movement of electrons around the nucleus. And it turns out that the innermost electrons are traveling at speeds that are close to the speed of light. And so that changes everything. And that's why we get a modification. But broadly speaking, it means that the elements are, if you like, misbehaving according to what they should be doing, according to the periodic table. I wrote an article a couple of years ago that appeared in Scientific American, and I described some of these things. And the editors illustrated it with a periodic table that was literally crumbling and falling apart. And they called it cracks in the periodic table. I tried to talk them out of it and said, no, this is an exaggeration, but you don't argue with editors of Scientific American. They know what sells. And they figured cracks in the periodic table. And it's an engaging title, and the diagram was quite nice. And it does get, I suppose, at the idea that it begins to look like there are limits to the periodic table, not just into what elements can be formed, but whether the periodic table whether the predicted behavior according to the periodic table is actually realized. And it does begin to look like that this is not the case. With super heavy elements, chemical periodicity does not apply.
Has anyone, I don't even know if this makes sense, but has anyone tried to take atoms of a certain element and put them in a bath or a milieu of countless amounts of electrons to see what happens to their behavior?
I don't know if they've done that. I know that with extremely heavy elements like 118, which It's called organeson. There's even some doubt as to whether the electrons are behaving in a radically different way, forming a sort of a gas where they're no longer in orbitals and shells, that you have almost a new form of matter there. And this is beginning to be probed. And of course, it's being done just theoretically at the moment. So not only is the element not behaving in the way that it should have behaved according to the periodic table, but it doesn't even have electron shells anymore.
Are there elements, higher atomic weight elements where we try to strip away all the electrons, and is there a limit where you can't do that without blowing apart the nucleus for some reason?
No, because the energy regime in which you're removing electrons is vastly different from the one where you're disrupting the nucleus. So it's regularly done to take every single electron out of an atom successively and measure the energies required to do that. That's been done, and there are tables of values that have existed for about 50 years where that's done in a routine fashion, and it leads to a lot of very useful information actually. So the nucleus remains.
What does it do to the elements? Does it turn into like a cracked out element that's fiending for electrons, and does it change its chemical properties? Or?
That's interesting. It would of course change the chemical properties. This comes back to the idea that you've now got successively more and more charged ions, but since the nucleus is still the same, you've still got the same element. I mean, the wonderful thing about the periodic table is that the identity, people say it's due to the number of electrons, but that's a rather secondary effect. It's really due to the number of protons in the nucleus. That's what identifies an element. So in your envisaged experiment where you're removing electrons more and more, you've still got the same element. It may behave chemically differently, but its identity is there.
Yeah, has there been a branch of chemistry where we're trying to find useful properties for denuded, uranium or denuded cobalt or some of the heavier elements?
This would be pseudochemistry. Not. I don't know that anyone is pioneering pseudochemistry yet, but we could always try and set something up.
I'm just taking it wherever my brain's taking it, so that's why I think I'd ask. Maybe it sounds silly, but
Yeah.
Interesting.
As you can see from the answers that I'm giving you, I'm very much more at the philosophical end, and rather than what has actually been done and what can be done. We philosophers like to hypothesize about the whole system and the relationship within the whole system, as opposed to the specifics.
So, what thought experiments have you had recently that you found to be very useful to you, or which experiments do you most wish would be done that would answer some questions you have?
Again, I'm looking at the entire system, so I'm interested in things like whether the F block, F for Freddy, whether I'm just saying that so it's understood on the telephone. The F is due to F orbital occupation. Whether the F block should be incorporated into the main body of the table. When you look at the standard periodic table that appears in almost every book and in every lab, you have this mysterious footnote consisting of 28 elements which are disconnected from the main body of the table. And everybody agrees that in principle that should be incorporated into the main body of the table. But precisely how you incorporate it is a matter of great debate. Some people believe that certain elements, such as lutetium and lawrencium, should be part of one block of the table. Others believe it should be part of the F block, and so on. So that's an ongoing question. And interestingly, the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, UPAC for short, adopts a somewhat ambiguous position over this matter. It regularly features a kind of periodic table, and one often sees that this is the officially recognized UPAC periodic table. On the other hand, UPAC refuses to approve any particular periodic table. So some of us are trying to get some changes made to this. I'm actually part of a UPAC working group which intends to make recommendations to UPAC that they had better make a decision, take a stand on this question instead of sort of pussyfooting around and saying we'll have it both ways. Because this is a question that's often asked by students and even professional chemists. If for instance, if it was discovered that lutetium and lawrencium genuinely belong to group 3 of the periodic table, then there may be properties that could be examined that wouldn't otherwise have been examined if we left those elements in the positions that they're currently in most periodic tables.
I guess there's no unified theory of periodic table or unified picture of it, just like that's missing in physics.
Correct. Yeah, and I think it's not a hopeless ambition to have. You're right. Actually, you're getting at unification. That we need more unification, and it is of course not just something that committees vote on. There's an interesting history of chemists and physicists simply taking a vote on certain things, which seems terribly anti-scientific. For instance, that Pluto was voted out of the solar system, which is very strange. And we have a similar thing in the periodic table, where the labels for the groups used to be 1 to 8 with A and B qualifiers. Now it's 1 to 18. That was a decision taken by a committee. We have similar issues going on now with group 3 of the periodic table, where these issues are particularly acute, and with the question of the long form of the periodic table, where the F block is incorporated into the main body. So this raises
you don't want the periodic table to become like the QWERTY keyboard, not efficient at all, but just there because of various societal pressures. That's not science.
Right. And yet one can't deny the role of some conventions in science. It's almost an interesting sociological question that merges into the philosophical. So, what did you say about keyboard? That sounded interesting. What?
Oh, there's different forms of the keyboard. There's the QWERTY one, QWERTY. That's the one that everyone uses. But I've read about it. There's the Dvorak. There's I think one's called the McLaren. I don't know. This one guy did a story on it, and it's interesting that the QWERTY keyboard is not efficient at all. You could type much faster and much better on Dvorak, and then there's a few other kinds, but yet QWERTY is the standard. Unfortunately, it's not the best one, but it's the standard. That's why everyone uses it. So same thing with periodic table. We don't want it to become just the most convenient one. We want it to be the one that best shows, the fundamental aspects of chemistry and physics.
Correct. Well, good, because when you said keyboard, I thought you meant like on a musical keyboard, but you meant a typewriter. There are some interesting analogies between musical keyboards and the periodic table, because, of course, fundamentally they both deal in periodicity. The question of octaves, you have middle C, and then you have the C beyond that, and you have the C beyond that. They all sound alike, but it's hard to define what we mean by alike. But anyone with half a musical ear can tell you that it's the same note, but further up on the keyboard. Music,
there are a lot of relationships. I mean, dissonant chords, versus major and minor. I mean, what people like, what's pleasant to the ear, what's not. That kind of informs how music is made. Rarely there's dissonant music, although there's some. So same thing with science, physics, chemistry, etc. Again, it's back to the craving of symmetry, the craving of beauty, the craving of even musical tones that kind of pushes us in a direction. But maybe it's for a reason.
Yeah. Ultimately, they are all related. Interesting. You mentioned beauty and elegance, and so on. That's a tricky one because, of course, beauty and order and so on is in the eye of the beholder to some extent. So what one observer might find elegant and regular in a periodic table, another one may find not so regular. So it's tricky and slippery, and traditionally it's one of the really hard things to define what we mean by beauty in mathematical equations. It's one of those things that you know it when you see it, but even then, two different people might not regard a change from one equation to another as an improvement in elegance and beauty.
But then again, you talked about the periodicity of the periodic table, and moving helium over, made a change that made it more, again, symmetrical, the behavior more. People don't like, I can see it in every endeavor. People don't like outliers. They don't like yes, but they want something to describe everything. And that's in every field. So it's funny that it's just like music. It's just like so many things. And it's funny that the universe seems to be laid out in that way, in a lot of ways. Maybe not in every way, but it's just weird that it has those properties, and our want kind of follows along with those properties.
Yeah, to me, it all points to unity, the fundamental unity of everything, which is a Taoist concept. It's sadly lacking from Western philosophy and Western religious and philosophical systems. I mean, the only person I know of who was deeply committed to the complete unity of everything was the philosopher Spinoza. But other than him, one has to go to Eastern philosophy to find a deep, deep appreciation of the unity of everything. And I'm going beyond, plants and animals and just everything, the oneness of everything. I'm very interested in oneness, if that doesn't sound too facile. My most recent book is an attempt to say that science progresses in a manner that is influenced by that oneness. I talk about traditionally we give credit to the discoverers of a particular effect or a particular law or a particular element, and there are tremendous debates about who got there first. From the point of view of science as a whole, it doesn't matter one iota who got there first. Science progresses irrespective of who. Similarly, there are countless arguments about multiple discoveries, and people think, well, why should multiple discoveries ever occur? Is there some connection in the ether or something whereby scientists on opposite sides of the earth arrive at the same idea? So again, that sounds spooky on one level. On the other hand, if science is regarded as one living organism, as it were, one unified living organism, that those things disappear. The priority disputes, the mystery behind multiple discoveries. And so in my most recent book, I'm trying to argue for an organic view of the scientific development, scientific process. Yes, it's full of individuals, and yes, those individuals are often arguing among themselves. And in fact, that's helpful. That's, in an evolutionary sense, that's productive, because we do like competition. Competition is rewarded with such things as Nobel Prizes. But in the final analysis, we tend to lose sight of the fact that there is maybe unity of purpose, although even then there isn't really unity of purpose. There's diversity of purpose, but it's fundamentally one thing.
Yeah, I think you're just expanding upon what I'm saying and vice versa. I mean, why are we craving one universal theory of physics? Why are we craving one periodic table that describes everything, quote unquote, best? It's the same thing. I mean, I think we all have that craving for oneness.
Absolutely.
Best.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Individuality is all well and good, but it's also scary. And it is perhaps more comforting to think that we belong to a unified entity instead of having to look after number one at all times.
No, yeah, I was going to say oneness could be just thinking of yourself too, but the idea, the attraction, the strange attraction to one or oneness presents itself in many, many forms, I guess.
Yeah. How can oneness be thinking of oneself?
Well, because you only worry about yourself, so there's your oneness. The one is you.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, it's a different form of oneness.
It is a form of oneness, of course it is. Yeah. Maybe unity is a better word. We're getting very deep, very, very deep here. Yeah.
Well, one last question I want to ask you. I brought it up before. I know we're running late here, but again, does it make sense to have a periodic table where certain elements will appear multiple times in different positions? Would that resolve things like helium appearing both on the top left and the top right?
That to me is like sitting on the fence. That to me it's kind of cheating. It's too easy a way out. I believe very much in the idea of one element, one space. And so even though it's hard work sometimes making a decision as to whether to put it here or there, it's worth the effort of pursuing that, because that's going to give you the most fundamental description. Of course, certain elements behave in a dual fashion, but again, if you're wanting the optimal table, then one shouldn't be put off by that schizophrenic behavior that certain elements show. Hydrogen is another one. that can equally well sit in the halogen group as it does in the alkaline metal group. And yet, and some periodic tables do put it in the other group. In some periodic tables, hydrogen floats majestically above the entire periodic table as a way of admitting that we don't quite know what to do with it.
Right.
That's a bit like saying that hydrogen is somehow above the periodic law, which would be incorrect, because every element is subject to the law of the land being the periodic law in the case of the elements. Why should hydrogen have this sort of royal privilege of not, until recently the British royal family did not pay taxes. These days they do, right. But for a long time they didn't pay taxes. They were above the law. Of course, we're trying to do the same thing over here now, but let's not get into that.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
So, all right, this brings up one more thing. So, one thing in science that irks me and I don't like, two things. One is quantum mechanics, because it's fuzzy and it's very hard to get a grasp of, and it doesn't seem to give a clear answer to things. And then the other one's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle.
Yeah.
So these things seem to go against oneness. How do you, I guess for lack of a better word, how do you feel about quantum mechanics as an explanation for things? How do you feel about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle? Do you not like them, but you have to deal with them? Or do you welcome them and you feel like it gives you a better understanding of the world?
Well, it's undeniable. It does give you a better understanding, and therefore, whether we like it or not, we had better accept it, since it's the best description. I think another way of saying it is that we have no right to impose on the microscopic world our way of thinking. So if it looks very, very strange that particles should be in two places at once to be extreme about it, or that, a particle can also be a wave, or the spin is not really spin, or the fuzziness in the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, that's because it's such an unfamiliar world that we are trying to impose our concepts on it. So the problem doesn't lie with the world, it lies with us. It's like anthropologists going to a so-called primitive tribe and saying, oh, isn't what they're doing weird? No, it's not necessarily weird. It's us imposing our habits on them, declaring that it's weird. So in a similar way, if this quantum mechanics gives the ultimate best current description of the world, then we have to live with it, however weird it looks. And it certainly does look weird. I agree with you. There are many very bizarre aspects to quantum mechanics.
Okay.
So I would. The last thing I would say on this is that it doesn't matter how we feel about it. It's not a matter of feeling. It's a matter of calculating and getting the best possible predictions. And for that, we just have to forego feelings.
Do we need a shirt to wear that says quantum mechanics doesn't care about your feelings?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, very good. Well, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. I know we went all over the place, but I think it was a great conversation.
I very much enjoyed this. It's rare that one has this kind of wide-ranging conversation. Certainly not with colleagues who are too busy with the details.
Shame. So, what's the best way for people to follow up, get your books, find out more about your work, and maybe even to engage with you somehow?
My website. Take it from my website, which I think you already have. And yes, I'd welcome people to get in touch if they're interested.
Okay. Well, very good, Eric. Thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Enjoyed it. Thanks, Richard.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.